The desert does not give up its dead easily. In the Valley of the Kings, the cliffs rise like broken walls of baked limestone, pale in the morning and bronze by dusk, their slopes cut by narrow ravines where loose stones slide underfoot and silence seems to gather in layers. The place looks empty at first, almost too empty for the weight it carries. There is only heat, dust, shadow, and a dry wind moving through a landscape that once received the bodies of Egypt's most powerful rulers. Somewhere beneath the paths of workmen, tourists, robbers, priests, surveyors, and forgotten labourers, one royal tomb still waits almost intact, sealed so quietly that even history seems to have mislaid it. For more than 3,000 years, Tutankhamun remains close to the surface and almost invisible. His burial lies not deep in some mythical underworld, but in a small tomb cut into the valley floor, hidden beneath debris from later work and masked by the practical accidents of ancient construction. Above him, Egypt changes beyond recognition. Dynasties rise and fall. Foreign armies pass through the Nile Valley. Temples lose their voices. Sacred names are broken, restored, translated, misunderstood, and carried away into museums. The gold of kings is stolen from many tombs long before modern archaeology begins. Yet this one burial, modest by royal standards and almost swallowed by chance, keeps its strange patience. The valley around him is chosen because it can be guarded, because it is separated from the living city, because its dry stone preserves what the damp world would destroy. Across the Nile from Thebes, New Kingdom pharaohs carve their tombs into hidden rock, while their mortuary temples stand nearer the fields. The geography itself becomes theology. The living look east toward sunrise, the dead travel west, toward transformation, toward the nightly journey of the sun, toward a rebirth prepared with astonishing care. Tutankhamun enters that system near the end of the 18th dynasty, during a time when Egypt has already known splendor, strain, reform, and confusion. Yet the tomb that will make him famous is not one of the grandest chambers in the valley. It does not unfold through long painted corridors like the burial places of mightier kings. It is compact, almost compressed, as though eternity has been hurried into rooms too small for the idea of a pharaoh. That contradiction is one of the first secrets the tomb holds. A king buried with dazzling wealth, but in a place that feels strangely constrained. A ruler whose name becomes the most recognized in ancient Egypt, but whose reign is brief, politically fragile, and later nearly erased. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The story ahead is not only about treasure. The treasure is the bright surface. Beneath it lies a quieter mystery about memory, power, restoration, and how a nearly forgotten ruler became the face of an entire civilization. Long before modern excavators disturbed the steps of the tomb, the Valley of the Kings has already been wounded. Robbers find many royal burials in antiquity. Ancient officials inspect damage, reseal doors, move royal mummies, and sometimes hide bodies together in caches to protect what remains. Tutankhamun's tomb is not perfectly untouched either. The evidence suggests it is entered in antiquity and then resealed, with some goods disturbed and small valuables likely missing. But compared with other royal burials, it survives with a fullness that feels almost impossible. That near survival depends on a sequence of accidents. Later tomb cutting and workmen's huts cover the entrance area. Flood debris moves through the valley and helps bury what people no longer remember to seek. Tutankhamun's name, already weakened by the politics that follow his reign. does not invite the same attention as the great warrior kings or the monumental builders. He becomes, in a sense, protected by obscurity. Fame can be dangerous to the dead. A known tomb is a target. A forgotten tomb may sleep, and yet the valley itself never fully forgets. Small traces remain in the ground, in scattered objects, in seals, in names appearing here and there like broken reeds on the surface of a buried river. Scholars still debate how much was known, suspected, or simply guessed before the final discovery. What survives in the record suggests that Tutankhamun was not entirely lost to Egyptology, but his resting place remained elusive enough to resist certainty. He was a king whose outline existed before his tomb was found, but the man behind that outline was thin, almost spectral, a throne name, a few objects, a shadow between larger figures. He was connected to the Amarna age, that unsettling moment when royal religion bends toward the Aten under Akhenaten, and then bends back again toward the older gods. But before the tomb opens, the emotional force of his story is still dormant. The valley's silence is deceptive because it is not empty silence. Beneath the dust are layers of labour. Ancient work gangs once cut corridors into living rock with copper tools, stone hammers, wooden handles, lamps, baskets, and trained patience. Artists painted protective scenes by lamplight. Priests carried ritual objects into darkness. Officials checked lists, seals, and storage. The body of a king arrived as the centre of a vast ritual machine built to deny decay and preserve identity. Even a smaller tomb demanded enormous coordination. Food, furniture, weapons, chests, beds, sandals, oils, jewellery, linens, shrines, amulets, statues, and magical texts all took their places in a landscape imagined as both tomb and cosmos. Somewhere in that compact arrangement, Tutankhamun lies within nested coffins and shrines, surrounded by objects meant to serve, not simply display. Modern eyes see magnificence, and magnificence is truly there. But ancient intent is more practical and more sacred. Gold is not only wealth, it is associated with divine flesh, imperishable radiance, the solar body of gods. Amulets protect specific parts of the body and guide transformation. Even a pair of sandals can become equipment for eternity. The tomb is a toolkit for survival in a world beyond ordinary sight. There is a lesser-known strangeness in this beginning. The most famous archaeological discovery in the world is, in physical terms, cramped, awkward, and partly improvised. Its power comes not from architectural grandeur but from concentration. Objects are packed close together, some carefully arranged, others stacked in ways that suggest urgency, limitation, or later disturbance. The tomb feels intimate because it has no vast distance in it. The visitors pressed close to the dead king's belongings, almost too close, as though time has failed to create the expected separation. It is not only that gold survives, it is that the ordinary and the divine survive side by side. For now, the entrance remains unseen beneath the valley floor. The sun passes over it season after season. Rain, rare but violent when it comes, pushes gravel through channels cut by older floods. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for every detail of the tomb's survival. Chance, obscurity, ancient repairs, and later construction all have their part. But in the longer quiet before discovery, Tutankhamun's greatest secret is not a curse, not a hidden chamber, not even the glittering mask that will one day stare back from photographs around the world. It is the fact that he is still there at all. Under stone and rubble, in a valley made for royal disappearance, the young pharaoh waits inside a small darkness loaded with impossible weight. The desert keeps him, not gently, but effectively. And because it keeps him, the modern world will eventually meet not the most powerful king of Egypt, nor the longest reigning, nor the most accomplished, but the one whose burial survived well enough to make the dead suddenly feel near. By the early 20th century, the Valley of the Kings has already been searched so many times that many sensible people believe there is little left to find. Its cliffs have been mapped, its known tombs numbered, its broken passages entered by travellers, antiquarians, and archaeologists. The valley no longer feels like a sealed kingdom of the dead, but like a place whose greatest secrets have been emptied, copied, catalogued, and argued over. To keep digging there requires more than training. It requires stubbornness, money, patience, and a willingness to look foolish in front of dust. Howard Carter has all of these in uneven measure. He is not simply a dreamer wandering through Egypt with romantic ideas of buried kings. He has worked in the country for years. He understands excavation as labour, discipline, and observation. He knows how easily an important clue can be ruined by haste, and how often archaeology depends not on one glorious moment, but on days of removing debris with very little to show for it. His patron, Lord Carnarvon, provides the money that makes the search possible, though even that support is not endless. By 1922, the hunt for Tutankhamun's tomb is close to its breaking point. Years of effort have produced fragments, hints, and frustration. The valley seems to be giving only enough to keep hope alive, not enough to justify it. The focus narrows to an area near the tomb of Ramesses VI, a place already complicated by later activity and ancient debris. It is not a romantic-looking spot. There is no grand doorway waiting in open view, no obvious sign carved for destiny. Instead, there is rubble, packed material, and the remains of workmen's huts. But archaeology often begins in such unpromising places. The past is rarely arranged for dramatic convenience. It hides beneath the ordinary leftovers of other people's work. In November 1922, the first step appears, then another. The shape of a descending stairway emerges from the valley floor, cut downward into the rock, leading toward a sealed doorway. The discovery is not yet the golden revelation the world will later imagine. At first, it is suspense mixed with caution. A stairway can lead to many things. A sealed door can conceal a tomb, a storage space, or a disappointment. Yet the seals and signs suggest royal importance, and among the traces connected to the doorway is the name that has been hovering for years just beyond reach Tutankhamun. This is the moment when the valley's long silence changes texture. It is no longer empty waiting, it becomes controlled urgency. Carter does not simply break through and rush inside. The sealed entrance must be documented, studied, and handled carefully. Ancient disturbance is possible. Modern damage is unforgivable. Messages are sent. Carnarvon comes to Egypt with his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert. The opening becomes not only an archaeological event, but a human scene full of tension. The excavator who has searched too long to breathe easily, the patron whose money has nearly run out, the companions who stand at the edge of a darkness that might still refuse them. Behind the first sealed doorway lies a corridor filled with rubble. This too must be cleared. The work is slow, because every basket of material may contain evidence. There are signs that the tomb has been entered in antiquity and then resealed. That fact complicates the excitement. If robbers have already reached the chambers, how much remains? Many royal tombs have been stripped so thoroughly that only fragments survive to tell of vanished splendour. Tutankhamun's name may be on the door, but the door itself cannot promise abundance. Then comes the second sealed doorway, and with it the famous narrow opening. Carter makes a small breach, inserts a candle, and lets his eyes adjust to the heated air that has been trapped inside. The flame flickers. At first, forms are unclear, then shapes separate from shadow-strange animals, gilded couches, chests, dismantled chariots, statues, vessels, objects piled in a chamber that seems almost unreal because it is not empty. When Carnarvon asks whether he can see anything, Carter's brief answer becomes one of the most repeated moments in archaeological history: wonderful things. The phrase endures because it is simple and because it understates what is happening. The first chamber is not the burial chamber itself, but the antechamber, crowded with objects that appear in the candlelight like a golden confusion. There is grandeur, but also disorder. Some items have been disturbed by ancient robbers. Others are stacked with care or packed out of necessity. The scene is not a museum display. It is a sealed room where eternity has been interrupted, repaired, and left in darkness. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in that first glimpse suggests both royal planning and human haste, both ritual precision and practical improvisation. The discovery changes Egyptology because it changes scale. Before Tutankhamun, scholars know Egyptian burial customs from texts, fragments, robbed tombs, decorated walls, and isolated objects. They understand much, but they are often reconstructing a vanished whole from pieces. Here, suddenly, is a royal burial assemblage with thousands of objects still together, still speaking to one another. The tomb becomes a kind of archaeological sentence that has not been fully broken apart. Its grammar can be studied: what was placed near what, which objects seem made for this king, which were reused, which were ritual necessities, which belonged to daily life, and which were included to transform the dead into something divine. It also changes the public imagination. Ancient Egypt has fascinated Europe and America long before 1922, but the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb arrives at a moment when newspapers, photography, global travel, and mass culture can turn an excavation into a worldwide event. Gold, youth, death, secrecy, and empire combine into a story almost too powerful for calm interpretation. Tutankhamun becomes not merely an archaeological subject, but an image. His tomb feeds fashion, design, cinema, advertising, and the dreamy modern idea of Egypt as a place of hidden splendor. Scholars must work inside that storm of attention, and sometimes against it. There is a quieter consequence as well. The tomb proves that patience in a nearly exhausted landscape can still be rewarded. It shows how easily modern certainty can harden too soon. The Valley of the Kings had seemed almost finished, and then the most famous tomb of all was found beneath the feet of people who had walked above it for years. That does not mean every romantic rumour is true, or that every blank space conceals a golden chamber. Archaeology is not a license for fantasy. But the discovery of Tutankhamun reminds everyone that the ground can preserve what expectation has dismissed. Carter's work after the opening is painstaking. The objects cannot simply be removed like treasure from a tale. They must be photographed, numbered, stabilized, drawn, packed, and studied. Fragile materials such as linen, wood, leather, flowers, and painted surfaces have survived because of the tomb's sealed dryness. But survival does not mean strength. Exposure itself is danger. A chair that lasts 3,000 years in darkness may suffer quickly under modern air and handling, The tomb demands a new level of conservation awareness, and the work will stretch over years, not days. Scholars still debate details of the tomb's history, including the sequence of robberies, resealings, object placement, and whether the burial was prepared under severe time pressure. But the central fact remains astonishing. Carter's narrow doorway opens not only into a room, but into a preserved royal world. The candlelight reveals a young king's afterlife equipment, but it also illuminates the ambitions, anxieties, artistry, and compromises of a kingdom recovering from religious disruption. The doorway is small as what it opens is vast, and as the first chamber emerges from darkness, Tutankhamun himself is still hidden deeper within, behind walls, shrines, coffins, and ritual protection. The world has seen the glitter around him, but not yet the fragile human centre of the story. The boy king waits beyond the wonderful things, and the tomb that has begun as a discovery of treasure is about to become a question about a life. Tutankhamun inherits a kingdom that has recently learned how fragile eternity can be. Egypt, for all its monuments and its formal language of permanence, is not frozen in certainty when he comes to the throne. It is unsettled, bruised by experiment, and still trying to understand what has just happened to it. The Nile continues its measured work. The fields flood and dry. Boats move between towns with grain, stone, papyrus, cattle, soldiers, priests, scribes, and officials. Temples still dominate the landscape, but beneath that visible order, the country has been pulled through one of the strangest religious and political transformations in its long history. The source of that disturbance is Akhenaten, the pharaoh who turns royal attention toward the Aten, the visible disk of the sun, with an intensity Egypt had not known before. Earlier kings honor solar gods, and Egyptian religion has always been capable of absorbing new emphases, new names, and new theological refinements. But Akhenaten's program goes further. He elevates the Aten above the old divine order, changes the language of kingship, redirects wealth and ritual focus, and founds a new royal city at Amarna, far from the traditional centres of power. There, in a desert bay framed by cliffs, he builds a capital meant to face the sun in a new way, open to the Aten's light, filled with boundary stelae, palaces, and temples without the dark inner sanctuaries older Egyptians would have recognized. For modern eyes, Amarna is fascinating because it seems to break the rules. Its art lengthens bodies, softens royal poses, exposes domestic intimacy, and presents the king, queen, and royal daughters beneath rays ending in tiny hands. But fascination should not be mistaken for simplicity. Scholars still debate how revolutionary Akhenaten's religion truly was in practice, how far ordinary people followed it, and how much older worship continued quietly outside royal ideology. Egypt is large, and even pharaohs cannot instantly change the habits of villages, households, craftsmen, and local priests. What survives in the record suggests a dramatic official shift, but the lived experience of that shift remains harder to recover. Tutankhamun is born into this world of sunlight and strain. His exact parentage has been studied through inscriptions, royal imagery, and modern genetic testing. Yet some details remain debated. He is closely tied to the Amarna royal family, almost certainly a son of Akhenaten according to genetic evidence, though the identity and status of his mother remain part of the difficult puzzle of late 18th dynasty genealogy. His early name, Tutankhaten, carries the Aten within it. Even his identity is stamped at first by Akhenaten's world. Then the Amarna experiment begins to collapse. Akhenaten dies, and the succession becomes obscure, full of damaged names and uncertain reigns. Figures such as Smenkhkare and Neferneferuaten appear in the record like shapes seen through dust, important but hard to place with complete confidence. Nefertiti, so vivid in art and so elusive in final history, may have played a powerful role near the end of the period, though the evidence remains incomplete. Egypt enters a narrow corridor of transition where throne names, regencies, co-rulerships, and political survival blur together. This is the world into which Tutankhamun rises, not a stable inheritance, but a restoration waiting to be negotiated. When he becomes king, he is very young, and that youth matters because kingship in Egypt is both a sacred role and a political institution requiring experienced hands. A young king can embody divine kingship, but he cannot personally manage all the machinery of empire, temple wealth, diplomacy, military command, and court faction. Around Tutankhamun stand older officials whose names will later loom over his story. Ay, an experienced courtier with deep roots in the Amarna period, is close to power. Horemheb, a military man of formidable ability, waits within the structure of authority. Priests, scribes, treasury officials, and administrators all have reasons to shape the restoration carefully. No single explanation fully accounts for who guided every decision, but the reign suggests powerful adults steering the royal ship through dangerous shallows. One of the clearest signs of change is the king's name. Tutankhaten becomes Tutankhamun, shifting from the living image of the Aten to the living image of Amun. The change is more than personal branding in ancient form. Amun, the great god of Thebes, had been central to royal power before Akhenaten's upheaval. Restoring Amun means restoring institutions, wealth, rituals, priesthoods, and a relationship between throne and temple that has been disrupted. The old gods return as pillars of public order. Temples are reopened or repaired. Divine statues receive attention again. Offerings flow back into traditional cults. In inscriptions, the restoration is framed as a healing after a time when temples had fallen into disrepair and gods had been neglected. This language is political as much as devotional. To say that the gods are restored is also to say that the present regime is legitimate. Tutankhamun's court must distance itself from the radical edge of Akhenaten without completely severing itself from the royal bloodline that gives the young king his claim. That balance is delicate. Too much continuity with Amarna risks angering those who see the period as disorder. Too much rejection risks undermining the king's own family foundations. The solution is a kind of controlled return. The monarchy does not simply pretend nothing happened. It absorbs, revises, and redirects memory. The physical world of Egypt reflects this repair. Thebes regains importance. Memphis, with its administrative and strategic value, likely plays a central role. Amarna loses its purpose as a capital and begins its long transformation from living city to abandoned evidence. People do not vanish overnight from a city of that scale, but the royal reason for its existence fades. Workshops close or move. Officials follow power elsewhere. The bright open temples of the Aten no longer define the future. Desert wind begins to claim walls built to announce a new age. For ordinary Egyptians, the restoration may have felt less like a single dramatic reversal and more like the return of familiar rhythms. Household piety, local gods, festivals, offerings, and ancestral customs likely carried on with resilience even during Akhenaten's reign. The official world had shifted violently in inscriptions and royal patronage, but daily religion often lives in smaller gestures, a charm worn near the body, a prayer whispered for protection, a household shrine. a visit to a local temple. The surprising detail is that Egypt's deepest continuity may have survived not because rulers protected it, but because ordinary practice is difficult to extinguish completely. Still, the restoration is not peaceful in the simple sense. It is a managed recovery inside an elite world where reputation, property, office, and theology are tangled together. The priests of Amun regain influence. Officials who served under Akhenaten must reposition themselves. Artists and craftsmen adapt their styles. Scribes change formulae. The king's image begins to look more traditionally Egyptian again, yet traces of Amarna refinement do not disappear instantly. Even in Tutankhamun's tomb, later viewers will find objects that seem to carry this mixed inheritance. Some perhaps made originally for others, some altered, some belonging to a court still rearranging its own memory. This is why Tutankhamun's world is so compelling. He's not famous because he conquers vast territories or builds colossal monuments. He's famous because his tomb survives. But the life behind that tomb belongs to a hinge moment, when Egypt is trying to step back from a revolution without openly admitting how deeply the revolution has disturbed it. By the time his burial chamber is sealed, the official story will have begun to smooth the difficulty. The old gods are honoured, Amun is restored. The machinery of kingship continues. Yet underneath the gold, Tutankhamun's Egypt remains a place where memory is being edited in real time. The gold makes Tutankhamun seem larger than life, but the body inside the nested protection tells a smaller, more fragile story. Behind the mask, behind the polished surfaces and the divine language of kingship, there's a human being who lives briefly, rules young, and dies before his life can widen into the long pattern expected of a pharaoh. This contrast is one of the reasons his story holds so strongly. Egypt tries to turn him into an eternal god. Modern science keeps bringing him back to bone, bloodline, disease, and damaged tissue. Tutankhamun's identity begins with a name shaped by crisis. He is first Tutankhaten, bound in wording to the Aten, the solar disk elevated by Akhenaten. Later he becomes Tutankhamun, tied instead to Amun, the restored god whose priesthood and temples return to public prominence. This change is often treated as a neat symbol of religious reversal, and it is that, but it also hints at the vulnerability of a young ruler whose very name must be adjusted to serve the needs of a recovering state. A pharaoh's name is not casual. It is theology, politics, legitimacy, and memory condensed into sound. For Tutankhamun, even identity is something the court reshapes. His family background is both famous and frustratingly difficult. He belongs to the late 18th dynasty, the royal house of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and the Amarna experiment. Genetic studies of royal mummies have suggested that he is very likely a son of Akhenaten, while the mummy identified as his mother appears to be a close royal relative, perhaps one of Akhenaten's sisters. Yet scholars still debate details of the family tree, because names are damaged, tomb labels can be uncertain, and royal marriages inside the dynasty blur relationships that modern categories prefer to keep clean. The evidence remains incomplete, and the more science reveals, the more carefully interpretation must move. Ancient Egyptian royal families often practiced close-kin marriage, not because they understood genetics in modern terms, but because kingship was imagined through divine blood, controlled succession, and the preservation of sacred status. This practice could concentrate power, but it could also concentrate biological risk. In Tutankhamun's case, studies have proposed that inherited conditions may have contributed to physical weakness or vulnerability. Yet it is important not to turn him into a simple medical case, as though his life can be explained by one diagnosis. Bodies from antiquity are difficult archives. Mummification changes tissue. Ancient damage and modern handling complicate evidence. DNA survives unevenly. CT scans reveal bone and structure, but not the full experience of a person. Tutankhamun's mummy has endured its own second history after death: the embalming, burial, ancient disturbances, and modern examination all leave marks. When Carter's team finally reaches the body, it is not found as the serene golden image suggests. Resin used in the burial has hardened around the coffins and mummy, making separation difficult and damaging. The body is darkened, fragile, and badly affected by the very substances meant to help preserve and sanctify it. Some of the damage that later looks dramatic does not belong to the moment of death at all, but to the long and complicated story of embalming, tomb conditions, and excavation. This is a humbling detail. Even the most carefully protected royal body can become a puzzle partly created by attempts to protect it. The mummy suggests a young man around 19 years old at death, though exact age estimates carry margins of uncertainty. He was not a child when he died, but he had not lived long enough to become the mature, commanding royal figure presented by Egyptian ideology. His images show him in conventional kingly forms smiting enemies, standing before gods, hunting, riding, receiving life and power. These scenes tell us what kingship needed to say, not necessarily what Tutankhamun's body could easily do. Egyptian art is not portraiture in the modern candid sense. It idealizes, ritualizes, and places the ruler inside a sacred grammar. Modern scans have raised questions about his feet, legs, spine, and general health. Some evidence has been interpreted as showing a clubfoot or other foot deformity, and walking sticks found in the tomb have encouraged the idea that he may have needed support. More than 100 sticks and staffs were included among the burial goods, though not all must have been medical aids. Some were symbols of rank, age, authority, or ritual power. Still, whereon some of them suggest real use. Here the evidence becomes quietly human. Among gold shrines and ceremonial objects, there may also be traces of a young king moving through palace spaces with difficulty, supported by tools that were both practical and royal. Other studies have proposed that Tutankhamun suffered from malaria, with genetic traces of malaria parasites detected in remains associated with the Royal Mummy Project. Some scholars see malaria as a serious contributor to his death, especially if combined with frailty, injury, or inherited conditions. Others caution that detecting infection does not automatically prove it was the cause of death. Ancient people could carry disease without dying from it, and death often comes from overlapping factors rather than a single clean explanation. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence, and that is part of why Tutankhamun remains medically mysterious. There has also been long debate over whether he died from an accident, an infection after injury, disease, complications of poor health, or some combination of these. Earlier theories of murder, especially based on damage to the skull, became popular because they fit the drama of a young king, a powerful court, and a suspicious succession. Later imaging weakened that idea by suggesting that some skull damage likely occurred after death, during embalming or modern handling. A fracture in the leg has been discussed as possibly occurring near the time of death, perhaps opening the way for infection, though interpretations differ. The truth may be less theatrical than murder, and more unsettling: a vulnerable young ruler in a world without modern medicine, living with inherited risks, disease exposure, and the dangers of daily life. The objects in his tomb add texture to the body's story. The walking sticks, the carefully made sandals, the clothing, the board games, the weapons, and the personal items do not create a medical biography by themselves, but they allow a glimpse of lived identity. Tutankhamun is not only a mummy under examination, he is a person surrounded by things chosen because they mattered in this world or the next. Some were symbols of divine kingship, some were practical. Some may have been childhood or youth objects preserved into burial, though such interpretation must remain cautious. What survives in the record suggests a young ruler whose physical presence was more complicated than the shining official image allowed. His marriage to Akhenaten, his half-sister or close royal relative and a daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, also belongs to this fragile political world. Their union likely helped stabilize dynastic legitimacy after Amarna, binding royal lines together in a way Egypt's court could recognize. In the tomb were two tiny mummified female fetuses, generally understood as likely daughters of Tutankhamun and Akhenaten. Their presence is usually discussed in terms of succession and dynastic failure, and it should be handled with care. They are part of the royal family's biological story, and their burial with the king suggests a protective funerary context, not a spectacle. For the dynasty, the absence of a surviving heir has enormous consequences. For the tomb, it adds a quiet note of family loss without needing dramatic embellishment. So the child behind the gold becomes, by closer inspection, neither a helpless puppet nor a magnificent warrior frozen in perfection. He is a young pharaoh whose body carries the pressures of royal bloodlines, whose name carries the pressure of religious restoration, and whose afterlife carries the pressure of an entire state, trying to make continuity appear unbroken. The mask offers serenity. The mummy offers questions. Between them stands Tutankhamun himself, still difficult to see clearly, still caught between divine image and human remains. Inside the royal palace, Tutankhamun's world is not quiet in the way his tomb will later be quiet. It is full of movement, scent, polished surfaces, murmured ceremony, and the soft machinery of power. A pharaoh may be described as divine, but divinity in Egypt still needs linen washed, meals prepared, sandals stored, letters drafted, oils mixed, chariots maintained, and rooms swept clear of dust. The young king lives at the center of a system that turns daily life into ritual, and ritual into government. Even when he eats, dresses, travels, receives officials, or appears before a god, the actions around him are shaped by rank, tradition, and the careful performance of order. The palace is not a single simple building in the modern sense. Royal life moves between residences, administrative centers, temple spaces, and ceremonial landscapes. Memphis likely matters greatly during Tutankhamun's reign, with its strategic position near the meeting of Upper and Lower Egypt, and its long association with administration, craft, and royal authority. Thebes matters because Amun has returned to prominence, and because the restoration of old cults gives the city renewed religious weight. Amarna, once built to embody Akhenaten's vision, still casts its long shadow, but its role fades. The young king's court belongs to a country trying to rebalance itself, and that means the palace is not merely a home. It is a stage on which Egypt demonstrates that the world is being put back into proper alignment. Tutankhamun's mournings would not have belonged entirely to him. A king's body is sacred property, and dressing that body is a political and religious act. Fine linen, carefully laundered and folded, touches the skin. Oils and perfumes mark status and purification. Collars, bracelets, belts, sandals, and headcloths do not simply decorate, they signal identity. The crown chosen for an appearance may declare a relationship to Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt, warfare, festival, or divine power. Even the false beard, when worn in ritual image, ties the king to the visual language of gods. The evidence remains incomplete for the exact rhythm of his private days, but what survives in the record suggests that royal routine was never fully private. The king's person was an institution. Food at court would have been abundant and varied compared with the diet of ordinary Egyptians. Bread and beer form the deep foundation of Egyptian nourishment, but royal tables could include roasted meats, fowl, fish, fruits, vegetables, honey, cakes, wine, and imported luxuries. Jars in tombs and inscriptions from elite settings remind us that eating in ancient Egypt was not only survival, but offering, prestige, and continuity. In Tutankhamun's burial, food and drink accompany him into the next life, because the dead king must be sustained just as the living king had been sustained. A surprising detail is that some foods placed in elite tombs were not symbolic in the vague sense. They were actual provisions, preserved or sealed as part of a practical afterlife economy. Eternity, for the Egyptians, still required supplies. The young pharaoh's education would have been shaped by his rank and by the crisis into which he was born. He would need to learn royal ceremony, the names and roles of gods, the meaning of crowns and festivals, the expectations of kingship, the history his court wanted remembered, and perhaps just as importantly, the history it preferred to revise. He may have been trained in writing or at least surrounded by scribes who managed written knowledge on his behalf. Scribes were the nervous system of the Egyptian state. They recorded taxes, offerings, orders, land, letters, inventories, temple goods, troop movements, and diplomatic exchanges. A young king did not need to personally write every command to rule, but he needed to inhabit a world where writing turned speech into authority. There is a temptation to imagine Tutankhamun as isolated behind curtains of gold, but royal life also involved performance before others. He appears in temples, where he offers to gods who are shown granting him life, stability, and dominion. He receives courtiers whose careers depend on proximity to him. He participates in festivals that connect the palace to the streets, the temple to the river, the human ruler to divine cycles. In these events, ordinary Egyptians may not meet the king as a person, but they encounter his image, his name, his procession, his role in sustaining Ma'at, the order that holds back chaos. This is kingship as cosmic maintenance, though behind the cosmic language stand real institutions gathering grain, directing labour, and redistributing wealth. The palace would also have contained a softer world of crafted beauty. Furniture from Tutankhamun's tomb gives clues to elite taste-gilded beds, inlaid chairs, carved animal forms, painted boxes, footstools showing bound enemies beneath the royal feet, and chests decorated with scenes of hunting and triumph. Some pieces are astonishing not merely because they are precious, but because they are intimate. A chair can carry the scale of a human body. A bed suggests rest. A game board suggests passing time. Sandals suggest movement across floors, courtyards, and packed earth. These objects narrow the distance between the king as symbol and the king as a young man living among things touched, used, stored, repaired, and finally buried. Games were part of elite life, and Tutankhamun's tomb contained boards for Senet, a game with both recreational and symbolic associations. Senet may have begun as entertainment and developed funerary meanings connected with passage through the afterlife, though scholars still debate the details of its rules and symbolism across periods. For a sleep documentary, it is tempting to dwell on the image a young king in a quiet room. pieces moving across squares while outside the palace scribes carry tablets and priests rehearse hymns. We cannot know such a scene directly, but the presence of game boards in the tombs suggests that play, strategy, chance, and ritual all belonged within the royal imagination. Hunting and chariotry also form part of his official identity. Tomb objects include chariots, bows, arrows, and scenes of royal mastery over animals and enemies. These images are not simple snapshots. They are statements of kingly power, even if the king's body was less capable than the imagery implies. A pharaoh is shown as vigorous because Egypt needs him to be vigorous. He dominates wild creatures because the ruler must defeat disorder. He rides, shoots, and conquers because royal art compresses ideology into movement. Yet some weapons and equipment may have been genuinely used, and the chariots themselves show advanced craftsmanship. The young king's world is one where physical ability, ceremonial expectation, and symbolic display overlap in ways modern viewers cannot always separate. At the centre of this palace life stands Akhenaten, royal wife and partner in legitimacy. Her presence in art, especially scenes of tenderness on some objects, preserves the Amarna habit of showing royal intimacy more openly than earlier conventions often allowed. One famous throne scene shows the queen anointing the king beneath the Aten's rays, a reminder that even after the restoration, visual traces of the Amarna world do not vanish all at once. That is one of the palace's most revealing secrets. Tutankhamun's court may officially return to Amun, but the objects around him still remember the style, language, and emotional grammar of the world that produced him. Daily life inside the royal sphere is therefore a blend of luxury and pressure. There is beauty, but very little freedom from meaning. A cup, a robe, a staff, a meal, a walk through a courtyard, a visit to a temple, even a board game can carry layers of status, theology, and expectation. The king is young, possibly physically vulnerable, and surrounded by adults whose experience far exceeds his own. Yet he is also the living centre of Egypt's restored order. People bow not only to the boy, but to what the boy represents: the return of divine balance after a dangerous experiment with the sun. And so the palace around Tutankhamun glows with contradiction. It is a place of perfume, linen, gold, wood, painted plaster, cool shade, and carefully prepared food. It is also a place where every gesture is watched, where every name matters, where every return to tradition helps bury a recent revolution without saying too loudly that the revolution happened. The tomb will later preserve the objects. The palace itself is gone, scattered through ruins and memory. But through those objects, the daily life of the young king still flickers, not as a complete portrait, but as a series of touched surfaces, worn handles, folded garments, and silent tools prepared for a ruler who had barely begun to live. The objects around Tutankhamun still remember Amarna, even when the official language of the reign tries to leave it behind. That is the strange afterglow of Akhenaten's revolution. It does not end cleanly. A capital can be abandoned, names can be changed, temples can be restored, and priests can return to their sanctuaries. But ideas do not vanish at the pace of royal decrees. Artists keep habits in their hands. Officials carry old loyalties into new offices. Workshops reuse materials. Families preserve connections that public inscriptions soften or erase. In Tutankhamun's world, the past is not behind him. It is under his feet, in his palace, in his bloodline, and eventually in the tomb that is meant to carry him beyond time. Amarna is often imagined as a sudden break in Egyptian civilization, a brief flash of sunlight that burns too brightly and then disappears. There is truth in that image, but it is too simple. Akhenaten's city is revolutionary in its official purpose, yet it is built by Egyptian workers using Egyptian tools, administered by Egyptian scribes, decorated by Egyptian artists, and inhabited by people who still need food, water, wages, protection, and burial. The Aten temples may open themselves to the sky rather than hiding a god in a dark inner chamber, but the state behind them remains recognizably Egyptian, hierarchical, ritualized, and dependent on labor, taxation, and royal command. What changes is the focus of sacred power and the way royal ideology speaks about it. For Tutankhamun, the collapse of that focus creates a problem deeper than theology. A pharaoh is not merely allowed to rule because he is alive and crowned. He must stand inside a chain of legitimacy linking gods, ancestors, monuments, rituals, and memory. Akhenaten has strained that chain. By elevating the Aten and diminishing the old gods, he has disturbed temple wealth and priestly authority, especially the influence of Amun. By moving the court to Amarna, he has pulled royal presence away from old ceremonial landscapes. By presenting himself as the unique mediator of the Aten's light, he has reshaped the relationship between king, god, and people. When Tutankhamun inherits the aftermath, the task is not only to choose Amun again, it is to make Egypt feel continuous after continuity has been wounded. The restoration is visible in names. Tutankhaten becomes Tutankhamun. Ankhesenpaten becomes Ankhesenamun. The Aten is not simply removed from personal identity. Amun is placed where Aten had been. These changes are small enough to fit inside a cartouche, yet large enough to signal a national direction. A name in ancient Egypt has power. To preserve a name is to preserve existence. To alter a name is to alter the shape of memory. The young royal couple becomes a living announcement that the old divine order is once again at the centre of kingship. The restoration stela, associated with Tutankhamun's reign, gives voice to this official healing. It describes temples fallen into neglect, shrines ruined, and gods no longer receiving proper offerings. Such language is not a neutral report, it is royal propaganda. But royal propaganda often tells us what a regime wants people to believe and what problem it needs to solve. The message is clear: the gods had been neglected. The young king has repaired the damage. Egypt breathes again. Scholars still debate how literally to read the description of collapse, because some older cults may have continued in limited or local ways even during Akhenaten's reign. Still, the stela shows how Tutankhamun's court frames its mission. His reign becomes an act of restoration before it becomes anything else. This gives the young king an unusual role. He's not remembered by later Egyptians as a great conqueror, not as a lawgiver, not as a builder of vast monuments. In his own moment, however, he is useful because he can embody return. He is royal blood from the Amarna family, which makes him legitimate, but he is young enough to be reshaped by advisors, priests, and officials. He can inherit Akhenaten without defending Akhenaten. He can restore Amun without entirely denying the line that placed him on the throne. His body becomes a bridge between a condemned past and a necessary future. No single explanation fully accounts for every political decision of the reign, but this balancing act sits at the heart of his importance. The art of the period reflects the same compromise. Some images return to more traditional proportions and religious forms, but Amarna influence lingers in details of softness, intimacy, and movement. The famous golden throne from Tutankhamun's tomb shows the king and queen in a scene of tender attention beneath the rays of the Aten, even though the king's later name connects him to Amun. This object alone reveals the difficulty of drawing a hard line between before and after. It is not simply an Aten object or an Amun object. It belongs to a world in transition, where political restoration and artistic memory overlap. Other objects may have been made originally for different royal owners and adapted for Tutankhamun. This possibility is especially important because the tomb contains signs of reuse, alteration, and hurried preparation. Royal workshops did not operate in a vacuum. Precious objects could be recut, reinscribed, reassigned, or folded into new funerary programs when politics demanded speed or resources. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars debate individual cases. But the broader pattern is plausible. Tutankhamun's burial is partly a museum of his own life, and partly an archive of a court still rearranging the remains of Amarna. Amarna's shadow also falls on the people around him. I, who later becomes pharaoh, has connections to the Amarna court and appears as a man skilled enough to survive ideological reversal. Horemheb, who will eventually take the throne after Aa, becomes associated with a more complete erasure of the Amarna rulers from official king lists. These men represent different forms of survival in a dangerous political climate. To live through a revolution is one thing. To remain powerful after the revolution is judged a mistake is something else. The court around Tutankhamun is filled not with innocent restorers, but with people who know how to edit themselves. The abandoned city of Amarna becomes the most physical symbol of this editing. Once it is no longer the royal centre, its purpose drains away. Buildings remain, but their meaning changes. The city that had been created to announce a divine vision becomes a quarry of memory, a place where later generations can remove stone, ignore names, or leave walls to crumble. Yet its ruins survive well enough for modern archaeology to recover houses, workshops, roads, boundary texts, art, and traces of daily life. The irony is sharp but quiet. An experiment later suppressed becomes one of the richest windows into an ancient Egyptian city because abandonment preserves what continuous occupation might have erased. For Tutankhamun, the long shadow of Amarna means he never rules in a simple present. He is always answering a previous reign. Every offering to Amun says something about Aten. Every restored temple says something about neglect. Every traditional image says something about a style that has not fully disappeared. Even silence becomes political. The court does not need to denounce Akhenaten constantly in order to move away from him. It can redirect resources, change names, restore festivals, and let time perform the erasure more efficiently than open anger. And yet, because Tutankhamun dies young, the repair remains unfinished. He begins the restoration, or more precisely, he becomes the sacred face through which others carry it out, but he does not live long enough to establish a long reign that could absorb the crisis into stability. His tomb therefore catches Egypt in mid-correction. It preserves not the calm conclusion of a restored world, but the tense moment when the old gods have returned and the marks of the Sun King still glow faintly on the walls of memory. The gold that surrounds him is brilliant, but beneath it lies a more delicate treasure evidence of a civilization trying to heal without fully admitting the wound. Behind Tutankhamun's restored name stands a court of older hands. The young king may wear the crowns, receive life from the gods, and appear in art as the flawless centre of Egypt's order, but the daily weight of rule cannot rest on youth alone. Around him are men who understand temple wealth, palace rivalries, military command, estate management, foreign diplomacy, and the dangerous art of surviving a change in religious policy. Their presence does not make Tutankhamun meaningless. In Egypt, the king's sacred role matters even when others guide decisions. But it does mean his reign must be read as a partnership between divine image and practical power, between the boy on the throne and the experienced figures who move the machinery around him. One of the most important of these figures is Ai. He is already an old and skilled courtier by the time Tutankhamun rules, and his career appears to reach back into the Amarna period. That continuity is revealing. Ai is not a simple enemy of Akhenaten's world, nor simply a loyal servant of the restored order. He is something more interesting and more typical of political survival, a man able to pass through ideological fire and emerge still close to the throne. Titles associated with him suggest intimacy with royal power, and later events show that he is no minor official. After Tutankhamun's death, I will become king himself, briefly stepping into the place once occupied by the young pharaoh. That later rise casts a long shadow backward over everything he does during Tutankhamun's lifetime. It is tempting to turn A into a hidden puppeteer, and popular imagination often enjoys that kind of simplicity. A young king, an ambitious elder, a sudden death, a throne waiting to be taken. The pieces look ready for a dark story, but archaeology rarely rewards such neat drama. Scholars still debate A's precise role in the reign, how much authority he held, and whether his later accession was carefully prepared or forced by circumstance. What survives in the record suggests influence, closeness, and political ability, but it does not prove every suspicion that later storytellers attach to him. He may have been a stabilizer as much as a climber, and in the unstable aftermath of Amarna, those two roles could easily belong to the same person. Another power stands in a different sphere, Horemheb. He is a soldier, administrator, and eventually pharaoh, a man whose career seems to gather strength from the military structure of the late 18th dynasty. Egypt in Tutankhamun's time is not isolated behind temple walls. It still holds interest in Nubia, the Levant, and the wider diplomatic world of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. The empire built by earlier warrior kings requires maintenance, negotiation, and force. Letters, tribute, garrisons, vassal rulers, and rival powers all form part of the background. A young pharaoh may be shown smiting enemies in formal scenes, but commanders and officials make such royal imagery possible. Horemheb belongs to that hard practical world. Horemheb's later reign will move more aggressively against the memory of the Amarna rulers, treating Akhenaten, his successors, and even Tutankhamun as a kind of interruption in the royal line. This is one of history's dry ironies. Tutankhamun becomes famous in modern times because his tomb survives, but in ancient political memory he is vulnerable to erasure. The men who help restore order during or after his reign are also the men who reshape the official story in ways that diminish him. Power behind the throne does not simply guide the present, it edits the past. Priests form another force, less easily reduced to individual personalities. The restoration of Amun is not only spiritual renewal, it is institutional revival. Temples are major economic centers, controlling land, labor, workshops, herds, storage, and offerings. When the worship of Amun returns to prominence, so does a network of people and resources tied to that god. The priesthood does not rule Egypt in place of the king, but it becomes essential to the restored order. The court needs Amun's temples to legitimate the reversal from Amarna. The temples need royal favor to regain full strength. Each side benefits from the appearance that harmony has returned. This relationship is delicate. If the king is too weak, temple institutions may dominate. If temple power grows too independent, kingship can feel constrained. During Tutankhamun's brief reign, the balance seems to favor restoration and repair, not open conflict. Offerings resume. Cult statues receive care. Building and restoration projects renew sacred landscapes. The young king's name appears in the language of healing what had been neglected, yet beneath the formal serenity of inscriptions, there must have been negotiation over resources, appointments, lands, titles, and memory. The evidence remains incomplete, but the scale of restoration implies coordinated effort across the state. Scribes and treasurers also matter, though they rarely attract the same attention as kings and generals. A state does not recover from religious upheaval by desire alone. It requires records, inventories, deliveries, craftsmen, quarrying, transport, taxation, redistribution, and orders that can travel. Officials such as Maya, known as a treasurer under Tutankhamun and later still important, represent the administrative intelligence of the regime. These men handle the material reality behind golden ideals. They know what must be paid, moved, rebuilt, sealed, counted, and stored. In a tomb like Tutankhamun's, where objects bear signs of reuse, adjustment, and rapid assembly, the administrative world is never far away. Someone must gather eternity from the available stock. The queen, Akhenaten, also belongs to the politics of the throne, though the surviving record leaves her frustratingly quiet. As a daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and the wife of Tutankhamun, she carries royal legitimacy in her own body and name. Her presence helps bind the restored kingship to the Amarna bloodline while redirecting that line toward Amun, after Tutankhamun's death. Traces connected to a widowed Egyptian queen seeking a foreign prince have often been linked by scholars to her, though the identification remains debated. Whether or not that episode belongs to Akhenaten, it reveals the kind of crisis a queen might face when succession fails and powerful men stand close to the throne. Royal women in Egypt can be politically important, but importance does not always leave a full archive. So the court of Tutankhamun is not a simple circle of loyal servants around a golden boy. It is a tense arrangement of interests held together by ritual, bloodline, necessity, and the shared goal of moving Egypt beyond Amarna. I offers courtly continuity. Horemheb offers military strength. Priests of Amun offer sacred legitimacy. Treasurers and scribes offer administrative muscle. Akhenaten offers dynastic connection. Tutankhamun, young and sacred, stands at the center because only the king can make restoration appear cosmically valid. Others may plan, advise, pressure, and benefit, but the official healing of Egypt must pass through his royal image. This is the quiet power of his reign. It may not be the story of a ruler personally commanding every detail, but it is not empty kingship. The king is the seal placed on a national repair, his body, name, marriage, rituals, and tomb become the meeting point of competing forces. And because he dies before those forces settle into a long, stable pattern, the people behind him become even more visible in the shadows. The gold mask will later hold the world's gaze. But behind that serene face stand older men, restored gods, careful scribes, a vulnerable queen, and a court that knows exactly how dangerous memory can be. The first rooms of Tutankhamun's tomb do not speak in a single voice. They murmur, contradict, repeat, and whisper over one another like objects caught between careful ritual and sudden necessity. A gilded couch shaped like a strange animal stands near chests packed with linen, jewellery, weapons, and clothing. Chariots lie partly dismantled, their wheels and frames pressed into the crowded antechamber. Black guardian statues face outward with the watchfulness of eternal servants. Boxes carry painted scenes of royal triumph, Alabaster vessels wait like pale moons in the dimness. Staves, bows, sandals, games, food containers, model boats, lamps, beds, fans, and ritual equipment crowd the space until the tomb seems less like an orderly palace of the dead and more like a compressed universe, packed too tightly around a young king who had no time to build a grander eternity. This is why the tomb matters far beyond gold. The gold is overwhelming, but the ordinary things are often more revealing. A gold mask can show what Egyptians believed a transfigured king should become. A pair of worn sandals can suggest the body that once moved through rooms, courtyards, and ceremonial spaces. A linen tunic can preserve the scale of a young man. A game board can hint at leisure, chance, and symbolic passage. A walking stick with wear on it can quietly challenge the heroic hunting scenes painted elsewhere. The tomb does not give a simple portrait. It gives layers of identity: the divine king, the courtly youth, the ritual dead, the political heir of Amarna, and the fragile human being hidden inside royal equipment. Carter and his team faced an enormous task because the objects were not arranged for modern understanding. The antechamber was crowded and disturbed, likely by ancient intruders who searched quickly for portable valuables before the tomb was resealed. Some items had been opened, shifted, or left in disorder. Others remained in positions that seemed intentional. The annex was even more chaotic, packed with jars, baskets, vessels, and supplies in a way that suggests either haste, disturbance, or both. Scholars still debate the exact sequence of robbery, restoration, and final sealing, but what survives in the record suggests that the tomb was entered soon after burial, partially robbed, and then repaired by officials who restored its sacred boundary without restoring perfect order. The chariots are among the most striking objects because they carry the royal image into motion. In Egyptian art, the king in his chariot is speed, dominance, youth, and power. He rides into battle, hunts wild animals, and asserts mastery over the forces of disorder. Tutankhamun's tomb contained several chariots, some more ceremonial, some possibly more practical, though the distinction is not always easy. Their presence does not prove that he was a great warrior in the physical sense, but it proves that he needed the afterlife equipment of a warrior king. Even a vulnerable ruler must enter eternity with symbols of strength. Egypt did not bury the king merely as he was. It buried him as he had to be. The weapons tell a similar story. Bows, arrows, shields, daggers, and other martial objects surround the dead pharaoh with the language of protection and conquest. One dagger in particular has captured modern attention because its blade was made from meteoritic iron, a material rare and extraordinary in Egypt before ironworking became common. The blade is not magical in the exaggerated sense sometimes suggested by popular retellings, but it is remarkable. It places sky metal beside the body of a king whose afterlife is bound to solar and celestial transformation. A lesser-known wonder is that such an object reminds us how wide Egypt's world was. Materials, gifts, techniques, and prestige items could move through networks reaching beyond the Nile Valley, even when the tomb itself feels enclosed and private. The clothing and textiles speak more softly. Linen survives because of the tomb's dry conditions, and in Tutankhamun's burial it appears in astonishing variety: garments, wrappings, folded cloth, gloves, sashes, and other pieces connected to royal life and ritual preparation. Textiles rarely survive well in many archaeological settings, so their presence is precious. They remind us that ancient splendor was not only hard stone and metal, it was also woven fiber, softness, repeated washing. Skilled hands and the quiet labour of people whose names are gone. Fine linen could be more intimate than gold, because it touched the skin, it moved with the body, it carried scent, sweat, oil, and status into daily life. The furniture is equally eloquent, beds with animal forms, elegant chairs, footstools, and boxes show the craftsmanship of royal workshops. They also reveal a world of symbolic domination. Footstools decorated with foreign enemies place conquered peoples beneath the king's feet, literally and ritually. Painted chests show scenes of the pharaoh defeating foes, reinforcing the idea that the ruler maintains order by subduing chaos at the edges of the world. Yet the tomb's furniture also has a domestic intimacy. A chair made for sitting is still a chair, even when covered in gold. A bed prepared for eternity still recalls sleep. The dead king's afterlife is imagined not as an abstract heaven, but as a continuation of royal existence with all necessary comforts and powers restored. Some objects appear to have been adapted from earlier owners, and this is one of the tomb's most important clues. Cartouches may have been altered, funerary equipment may have been reassigned. Certain items seem stylistically connected to the Amarna period, or possibly made for someone else before being brought into Tutankhamun's burial. The evidence remains incomplete, and each object must be judged carefully. But the broader impression is that the tomb is not a perfectly planned lifetime project. It is partly assembled from available royal materials during a moment of urgency. This does not make the burial careless. It makes it human, administrative, and political. Even eternity had deadlines. The nested shrines and coffins deeper in the burial chamber belong to a more formal sacred program. But even there the objects carry complexity. The king is protected by layers wooden shrines covered with gold, stone sarcophagus, coffins, amulets, wrappings, mask, and spells. Protection is physical, magical, theological, and visual all at once. Every layer says that the body must be guarded because the king's identity must survive. In Egyptian belief, the dead are not simply gone. They must be transformed, fed, named, remembered, and defended against dissolution. The tomb is therefore a machine for continuity, built from words, images, materials, and ritual logic. The guardian statues near the sealed burial chamber embody that logic beautifully. Dark, gilded, and alert. They are not decorative figures in the modern sense. They stand as protectors of the threshold, royal doubles, divine sentinels. Their presence gives the tomb a psychological force that photographs can only partly capture. They face outward, toward anyone entering, while the king lies hidden beyond them. The effect is almost theatrical, but it is also deeply Egyptian. The boundary between the living and the dead is watched, guarded, and ritually charged. What the objects finally reveal is not one secret, but a pattern of secrets. Tutankhamun's tomb is luxurious, yet small, carefully sacred, yet disorderly in places, traditional, yet full of Amarna echoes, personal, yet saturated with ideology, young, yet obsessed with eternity. It preserves a royal life, but it also preserves the labour of hundreds of invisible people, carpenters, goldsmiths, weavers, painters, embalmers, scribes, priests, guards, and officials. The king is the centre, but the tomb is the work of a civilization. So the objects speak because they survive together. Removed one by one, they can seem like treasures. Seen as an assemblage, they become a map of a crisis managed through ritual beauty. They show Egypt gathering every available sign of protection, power, comfort, and legitimacy around a young ruler whose reign had been short and whose death came too soon for calm preparation. The tomb is not merely full, it is anxious, it is trying, with gold and linen and wood and words, to make certain that Tutankhamun will not disappear. The body in the burial chamber is the point toward which every object has been moving. The chariots, beds, staffs, jewels, weapons, linen, shrines, and guardian statues all form a widening circle around one fragile centre, the mummy of Tutankhamun, sealed inside layers of ritual protection and yet unable to protect itself from the questions of later centuries. When modern investigators look at him, they do not find the calm perfection promised by royal art. They find a damaged body, darkened by resins, altered by embalming, affected by time, and burdened by interpretations that have shifted with every new method of examination. The gold mask presents certainty. The mummy refuses to do the same. At death, Tutankhamun is probably about 19 years old, a young adult by biological age but still a short-lived ruler in political terms. Ancient Egypt expects kings to embody strength, continuity, and divine balance. The dead king's body is prepared not merely as remains, but as the foundation for his transformed existence. Embalmers work within a tradition that has developed over centuries, removing internal organs, drying the body with natron, wrapping it in linen, placing amulets in carefully chosen positions, and using oils and resins to sanctify and preserve. But Tutankhamun's mummy shows that preservation is never simple. The very resinous substances meant to protect and consecrate him later harden, darken, and bind the body to its coffins in ways that make modern removal extremely difficult. When Carter's team finally reaches the mummy, they face a problem that earlier treasure-filled rooms have not prepared them for emotionally. The most sacred object in the tomb is also the most vulnerable. The mummy is encased in nested coffins, one of them made of solid gold, and covered with funerary equipment of extraordinary richness. Yet the body itself is not an untouchable miracle. It is damaged, stuck, and difficult to separate from the hardened materials around it. Methods used in the 1920s, judged by later conservation standards, are invasive. The mummy suffers during extraction and study. This is one of the uncomfortable truths of the discovery. The excavation that preserved Tutankhamun's fame also contributed to the damaged condition through which his body is now studied. The early drama surrounding his death grows partly from this damage. For decades, theories come and go. A blow to the head is proposed. Murder becomes an irresistible story. A young king dies unexpectedly. Powerful older men stand near the throne. Succession becomes uncertain. A soon becomes pharaoh. The ingredients seem ready-made for suspicion. Popular accounts build around palace intrigue, assassination, and hidden violence. But later imaging complicates this interpretation. Damage to the skull that once seemed suspicious is now generally understood by many researchers as likely post-mortem, connected to mummification, handling, or later examination rather than a fatal attack. The evidence remains incomplete, but the murder theory has lost much of its earlier force. That does not mean the death is solved. It means the mystery has become less theatrical and more difficult. A fracture in the left thigh bone has been discussed as possibly occurring near the time of death. If such an injury happened while Tutankhamun was alive, infection could have followed, especially in a world without antibiotics. Some have imagined a chariot accident, partly because chariots and hunting imagery are so visible in the tomb, but the evidence does not prove such a scene. Egyptian royal art routinely presents kings as vigorous hunters and warriors, regardless of their actual physical condition. A chariot accident remains possible, but not certain. It is an inference built from injury, context, and imagination, not a witnessed event. Health studies have added further complexity. Genetic and medical research has suggested that Tutankhamun may have suffered from malaria, and traces interpreted as malaria parasites have been reported in association with the royal mummies. Malaria can weaken, recur, and become dangerous, particularly when combined with other conditions. Yet infection alone does not automatically explain death. Many people in ancient environments lived with repeated illnesses. The question is whether malaria was the fatal cause, a contributing factor, or one more burden on an already vulnerable body. No single explanation fully accounts for this, and the most cautious answer may be that Tutankhamun died from a convergence of risks rather than one clean event. His physical condition has also been debated. CT scans and other studies have examined his feet, legs, and bone structure. Some researchers have proposed that he had a clubfoot or other deformities affecting mobility. Others have argued for a more careful reading of the evidence, noting how mummification, damage, and interpretation can complicate diagnosis. The walking sticks in the tomb strengthen the impression that mobility mattered. More than 100 staffs and sticks were buried with him, and some show signs of use. But even here the interpretation must remain balanced. Sticks in royal context can be symbols of authority, age, prestige, ritual identity, or travel, not only medical supports. Still, the possibility that some were practical gives the tomb a quieter, more human dimension. The mummy has been described at times as revealing a weak or sickly king, but that phrase can be misleading if pushed too far. Ancient bodies often carry signs of stress, disease, injury, and adaptation. A person can be physically limited and still perform public roles. A young ruler can require assistance and still embody kingship. Egyptian ideology does not need the king to be an athlete in the modern sense. It needs him to be ritually effective. If Tutankhamun had difficulty walking, if he suffered from infection, if inherited conditions affected his body, the court could still present him as the living image of divine order. In fact, the pressure to present him as strong may have grown precisely because his actual body was vulnerable. The debate over his parentage matters here too. Close royal kinship, suggested by genetic analysis, may have increased the risk of congenital problems, but this should not be exaggerated into a simple explanation for everything. Genetic studies of ancient mummies are powerful, but they are not magic windows. DNA can degrade, samples can be contaminated, family relationships can be inferred with varying degrees of confidence. Royal genealogy in the Amarna period is unusually tangled, with missing names, damaged inscriptions, and possible co-regencies. What survives in the record suggests close family connections, but translating those connections into a complete medical story remains uncertain. There are other mysteries in the mummy's preparation. Tutankhamun's heart appears to be absent, unusual because the heart held deep importance in Egyptian beliefs about identity and judgment. The reason is unknown. It may relate to damage, embalming choices, or circumstances of death, but certainty is out of reach. His penis was embalmed erect, a detail sometimes treated sensationally, but more soberly interpreted by some scholars as possibly linked to Osirian symbolism and royal rebirth. His body was heavily coated in black resin, perhaps giving him an association with Osiris, fertility, and regenerative darkness. These details remind us that the mummy is not only medical evidence, it is also theology applied to flesh. The body therefore sits at the crossing point of science and sacred intention. Modern researchers ask how he died, what diseases he carried, whether he walked with difficulty, whether an injury became infected, whether malaria contributed, whether inherited conditions shaped his life. Ancient embalmers and priests asked a different question. How can this king become eternal? They placed amulets, wrapped limbs, used resins, invoked protective forces, and sealed him inside a golden grammar of transformation. To them, the important fact was not diagnosis but survival beyond death. And yet the modern questions persist because the ancient project succeeded just enough. If the body had vanished, there would be only art and rumour. Because it survives, it can be scanned, measured, debated, and reinterpreted. Each generation brings new tools and new caution. The most honest portrait is not of a murdered boy, nor of a perfectly understood patient, but of a young pharaoh whose death remains partly hidden beneath damage, ritual, disease, politics, and time. The mummy does not solve Tutankhamun's story, it deepens it. Beneath the gold lies not an answer, but a body still carrying the marks of a life Egypt tried to turn into eternity. The tomb's smallness is one of its quiet shocks. After the golden mask, the nested coffins, the guardian statues, the chariots, the weapons, the gilded shrines, and the thousands of objects that made Tutankhamun famous, it is easy to imagine a vast royal monument hidden beneath the valley floor. But the actual tomb is modest, almost cramped, with only a few chambers arranged in a plan that feels strangely insufficient for a pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. It is not poor. Nothing about the burial assemblage is poor, yet architecturally it does not speak with the long, descending confidence of larger royal tombs. It feels like a place adapted under pressure, a sacred space made to serve an emergency. That is the sudden burial problem. Tutankhamun dies young, probably around 19, and his death does not seem to have been expected after a long, orderly decline. Egypt has burial traditions, royal workshops, embalmers, priests, administrators, and storage systems capable of great preparation. But time still matters. A royal burial is not a single object, it is a whole event. The tomb must be ready. Walls may need cutting and painting. Shrines and coffins must be assembled. Funerary texts must be placed. Objects must be selected, transported, repaired, purified, arranged, and sealed. The body must be mummified, a process that itself takes weeks. If a king dies before a grand royal tomb is finished, the court must solve the problem quickly, because ritual time cannot wait forever. Tutankhamun's tomb, known today as KV62, may have originally been intended for someone of lower status, perhaps a private individual or a royal figure not initially expected to occupy a full pharaonic burial. Scholars still debate the original intended owner and the exact sequence of adaptation, but the tomb's size and plan make the question unavoidable. The burial chamber is the only room with painted decoration, and even that decoration is limited compared with the elaborate programs in many royal tombs. Other spaces remain undecorated. The wall scenes present essential religious moments, including the king's funeral and his reception into the divine world, but they do not create the long cosmic journey seen in grander royal burials. The art seems focused, efficient, and complete enough for ritual purpose, rather than expansive. This does not mean the burial was careless. Ancient Egyptians did not treat royal funerary ritual lightly. The compactness of the tomb may reflect urgency, but urgency is not the same as neglect. The court appears to have done what was necessary to transform Tutankhamun properly. He is mummified, protected with amulets, enclosed in coffins and shrines, surrounded by goods, and sealed behind ritual boundaries. The sacred requirements are met, yet the way they are met suggests compression. Eternity has been fitted into available architecture. The evidence of reuse strengthens this impression. Some items in the tomb may have been made for Tutankhamun, while others appear altered, re-inscribed, or perhaps originally intended for different royal persons from the Amarna period. This was not unusual in a world where precious materials and royal workshop products carried immense value. But in Tutankhamun's case, the pattern feels especially revealing. A young king dies, a dynasty is unstable, the court needs a complete burial quickly. Objects already available in royal stores may be reassigned, names changed, and meanings adjusted. What survives in the record suggests not a single clean plan, but a practical gathering of sacred equipment under difficult circumstances. The coffins and shrines themselves have been studied for signs of adaptation. Some scholars have proposed that parts of the burial equipment, perhaps even elements close to the mummy, were originally made for a female royal figure or another Amarna ruler, and then altered for Tutankhamun. These arguments remain debated, and each object carries its own technical complexities. Style, proportions, inscriptions, and alterations can all suggest reuse, but interpretation is rarely simple. Ancient artisans could work in varied styles. Political change could affect names and imagery. Later damage can confuse original evidence. Still, the possibility of reassigned funerary goods fits the larger atmosphere of the tomb magnificent, but assembled in haste from a world still recovering from upheaval. The burial chamber paintings add another layer. Their style has often been noted for its unusual qualities, including figures that seem to retain hints of Amarna-era proportions and softness while serving a restored religious program. The most famous wall scene shows A performing the opening of the mouth ritual for Tutankhamun. This is extraordinary because I is already shown in the role of successor, wearing royal attributes as he carries out the rite that helps the dead king breathe, speak, eat, and live again in the afterlife. This scene is sacred but also political. It declares that Tutankhamun has been properly transformed and that I now stands in the kingly line. In a tomb shaped by haste, succession is painted directly onto the wall. That image can feel almost too revealing. I, the elder courtier, appears as the one who ritually completes Tutankhamun's passage. Soon after, I is pharaoh. Was this a planned transfer of power, a necessary response to the absence of an heir, or the result of court factions moving quickly in a dangerous moment? The evidence remains incomplete. Suspicion has often filled the gap, but suspicion is not proof. What can be said more safely is that Tutankhamun's death created a succession problem, and the tomb preserves part of the solution. The dead king is honoured, the next ruler is legitimised, the ritual and political worlds meet in paint. The arrangement of the rooms also preserves traces of ancient disturbance. Robbers seem to have entered the tomb not long after burial, probably searching for portable valuables, oils, perfumes, jewellery, or precious materials that could be taken quickly. Officials then resealed the tomb, and in doing so they did not restore every object to a perfect original order. This helps explain the crowded and sometimes chaotic appearance of the antechamber and annex. It also complicates any attempt to read the tomb as a pure snapshot of the funeral day. The tomb is not one moment frozen intact. It is at least several moments layered together: burial, robbery, inspection, resealing, forgetting, discovery. The small tomb may also owe its preservation to this very lack of grandeur. A massive royal tomb would have been more visible, more famous, and more attractive to robbers. Tutankhamun's modest burial, tucked beneath later debris and overshadowed by other activity in the valley, survived partly because it did not announce itself loudly enough. This is one of history's elegant accidents. The insufficiency of his tomb may have protected its contents. The rush solution became the condition of survival. The king who did not receive the most imposing architectural eternity received instead the most famous archaeological afterlife. The sudden burial problem therefore changes how the treasure is understood. The tomb is not merely a display of wealth. It is evidence of a court working under pressure after the unexpected death of a young pharaoh in a politically delicate age. It shows the practical side of eternity. Storage rooms opened, objects selected, names altered, rituals performed, walls painted, seals pressed, guards posted, and then silence imposed. Behind the gold is administration. Behind the sacred order is improvisation. Behind the calm face of the mask is a deadline. And perhaps that is why the tomb feels so strangely alive. It does not preserve a perfect royal plan carried out over decades. It preserves a response. It catches Egypt in motion, solving a problem quickly with every tool its civilization can provide: theology, craftsmanship, bureaucracy, memory, and gold. Tutankhamun dies before his reign can fully define itself, and his burial is made to close the wound. But because the closure is hurried, seams remain visible. Those seams are where the mystery breathes. The curse begins where archaeology meets imagination. It grows from sealed doors, sacred warnings, sudden death, newspaper hunger, and the modern world's uneasy feeling that perhaps some places should not be opened too casually. Tutankhamun's tomb contains enough real wonder to need no invention. Yet almost from the moment it enters public attention, a second tomb forms around it, a tomb made of rumour. In that shadow version, the Valley of the Kings is not only a burial ground but a trap. The young pharaoh is not only a dead ruler but a silent avenger. The archaeologists are not scholars and workers but intruders marked by an ancient power, waiting 3,000 years to strike. It is a powerful story, and like many powerful stories, it survives because it is simpler than the truth. Ancient Egyptians did believe tombs required protection. They knew robbery was a danger, and they understood the dead as beings who needed offerings, names, memory, and ritual safety. Some tombs and funerary texts include warnings, threats, or protective formulas aimed at anyone who might damage the burial, steal offerings, or disturb sacred order. These were not theatrical curses in the modern horror sense, but part of a religious and social system in which the tomb was a charged place. To violate it was not merely to trespass, it was to damage a person's afterlife and offend divine order. The Egyptians protected tombs with architecture, secrecy, guards, seals, magic, and fear, because fear can be useful when stone doors are not enough. Tutankhamun's tomb, however, does not produce a clear ancient curse inscription of the kind later legend requires. The famous curse is largely a modern creation built around events after the discovery, especially the death of Lord Carnarvon in 1923. Carnarvon, who financed Carter's excavation, dies months after the tomb is opened, following complications from an infected mosquito bite. In the atmosphere of the time, this death becomes irresistible. A wealthy aristocrat enters the pharaoh's tomb and dies unexpectedly. The newspapers have their symbol. Egyptomania already grips the public imagination, and the idea of a curse gives the story a darker pulse. Treasure alone fascinates. Treasure guarded by supernatural revenge sells even better. The timing matters. The early 1920s are an age of mass newspapers, global headlines, spiritualism, post-war grief, and fascination with the exoticized ancient world. Many people are already primed to think of Egypt as mysterious in a romantic and often distorted way. The tomb's opening becomes not just an archaeological discovery but a public drama. Access to official information is controlled, and when journalists cannot get enough facts, speculation fills the gaps. Rumour has room to breathe. Small incidents are tied together, coincidences become patterns, illnesses become omens, a power cut in Cairo, a pet's death, a fever, a delay, a whisper from a worker or visitor, all of it can be pulled into the growing mythology. Carter himself lives for many years after the discovery, which should have weakened the curse story considerably. Many others who enter or work with the tomb also live ordinary spans of time. Statistical studies and calmer historical reviews have repeatedly shown that the curse does not hold up as a pattern of supernatural punishment. The evidence remains incomplete for every personal story attached to the excavation. But the broad claim that those who opened the tomb were rapidly struck down is not supported. It is a legend assembled by selection. The deaths that fit are remembered. The lives that do not fit are ignored. Still, the curse legend is not meaningless. It reveals something important about the emotional force of the tomb. Modern people often speak as though they have left ancient fears behind, but the tomb awakens older instincts. A sealed burial chamber feels like a boundary. A mummy is not just an object. A royal corpse surrounded by sacred symbols makes even skeptical observers lower their voices. There is a moral tension in excavation itself, the desire to know against the fact of disturbing the dead. Archaeology can be careful, scientific, and respectful, but it still opens places designed to remain closed. The curse story gives supernatural shape to that discomfort. There were also real dangers in tomb work, though not magical ones. Ancient sealed spaces can contain dust, mold, bacteria, unstable air, sharp debris, weakened structures, and toxic residues from materials used in burial or conservation. Workers in the early 20th century did not have the protective equipment, conservation protocols, or health awareness used today. The Valley of the Kings itself brings heat, dehydration, infection risk, and physical strain. A person could become ill after working in such an environment for reasons that are entirely natural. No single explanation fully accounts for every illness later folded into the curse legend. But natural hazards are more credible than supernatural vengeance. The legend also hides the Egyptian workers who made the discovery possible. Popular curse stories tend to focus on European names: Carter, Carnarvon, Lady Evelyn, officials, visitors, collectors, journalists. But the excavation depended on Egyptian labourers, foremen, guards, technicians, and local knowledge. Their lives are often pushed to the edges of the tale, just as their hands were essential to the work itself. A more grounded history must remember that the tomb was not revealed by one man alone. It emerged through a network of labour, skill, financing, permission, documentation, and local experience. The curse myth narrows the story into drama. Archaeology widens it back into human work. Ancient belief deserves more respect than the modern curse story gives it. Egyptian funerary religion was not a cheap trap for intruders. It was an intricate system of rebirth, identity, protection, and cosmic order. The dead king needed his body preserved, his name spoken, his offerings maintained, and his transformation secured through ritual knowledge. The tomb's protective power was part of this system, but its purpose was not to entertain future imaginations with revenge. It was to help the dead survive. When modern legend turns that into a horror device, It distorts the seriousness of the ancient worldview. Yet the curse cannot simply be dismissed as foolishness, because it became part of Tutankhamun's modern afterlife. It shaped how millions encountered him. For some, the first image of the boy king was not a historical ruler or a religious restoration figure, but a golden face surrounded by danger. The curse made him active in death, as though his brief life had gained power through mystery. It also protected the tomb in a strange modern sense by making people feel that disturbance had consequences. Even a false story can carry a true anxiety. The reality is more subtle and more haunting. There is no convincing evidence that Tutankhamun's tomb killed those who opened it by supernatural means. There is strong evidence that the tomb entered a world eager to mythologize it, and that ancient Egyptian death rituals still possess enough symbolic force to unsettle modern certainty. The curse is not an ancient weapon. It is a modern mirror. It reflects desire, guilt, fear, fascination, and the uneasy knowledge that the dead were once people who expected privacy, ritual care, and continuity. So the rumours fall away, but the atmosphere remains. Stand imaginatively at the sealed doorway, with the guardian statues behind, the burial chamber beyond, and the young king enclosed in gold, resin, linen, and prayer. And it is easy to understand why the story grew, not because a curse was waiting in the air, but because the tomb itself was powerful enough. It didn't need to strike anyone down. It only had to open, and the modern world supplied the ghosts. The deeper one looks into Tutankhamun's tomb, the more it seems to point beyond itself. Its rooms are small, its contents immense, its walls painted with a strange economy, and its royal names carry the aftershocks of Amarna. For many years, the greatest mystery appeared to be what had already been found: the mask, the coffins, the mummy, the objects, the signs of haste, the rumours of death. But in modern times another question has pressed against the walls, almost literally. What if the tomb is not only a burial, but part of a larger story still hidden in the rock? What if the most famous tomb in Egypt still keeps a door closed? This possibility becomes especially powerful because Tutankhamun does not stand alone. He is the survivor of a royal family whose last years are full of missing pieces: Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Smenkhkare, Neferuaten, Ankhesenamun, Tutankhamun, and Horemheb form a chain of names connected by power, marriage, restoration, erasure, and uncertainty. Some are vivid in art and obscure in death. Some appear briefly in inscriptions, then vanish. Some may overlap in ways scholars still debate. The late Amarna period feels less like a straight royal sequence than a room filled with broken mirrors, each reflecting a different angle of the same crisis. Nefertiti is the most magnetic of these missing figures. Her face, known from the famous painted bust, has become almost as recognizable as Tutankhamun's mask. Yet her final years remain one of ancient Egypt's great unresolved problems. She is shown with extraordinary prominence during Akhenaten's reign, participating in ritual scenes, appearing beside the king beneath the Aten's rays, and at times occupying visual space that suggests exceptional authority. Then her trail becomes difficult. Did she die before Akhenaten? Did she rule under another name? Was she connected to the shadowy figure Neferuaten? Was she buried at Amarna, moved later, or laid to rest somewhere in the Theban west? The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for all the inscriptions, omissions, and later erasures. Because Tutankhamun's tomb is small and unusually arranged, Some scholars have wondered whether it may have been adapted from a burial originally prepared for someone else, perhaps even a royal woman from the Amarna family. This idea gained public attention through proposals that hidden chambers might lie behind the painted walls, possibly containing the burial of Nefertiti. The argument drew on architectural observations, wall features, and the broader logic of a hurried royal burial. If Tutankhamun died unexpectedly and needed a tomb quickly, perhaps an existing royal tomb was repurposed. If so, could another burial remain beyond his rooms, sealed and undisturbed? It is an extraordinary possibility, and extraordinary possibilities require careful restraint. Radar surveys and technical studies have produced differing interpretations over the years. Some readings suggested anomalies behind the walls. Later examinations cast doubt on the presence of large hidden chambers. Archaeology moves slowly in such cases because the stakes are enormous. One does not simply cut through painted walls in the most famous tomb on Earth because a theory is attractive. The tomb is fragile, heavily visited, historically priceless, and already affected by earlier excavation and conservation challenges. Curiosity must answer to preservation. The appeal of a hidden Nefertiti chamber is easy to understand. It would join the two most iconic faces of the Amarna age, the Golden Boy King and the Queen, whose beauty has become a modern symbol of Egyptian elegance. It would also solve, or seem to solve, two mysteries at once: why Tutankhamun's tomb is so small, and where Nefertiti finally rested. But the danger lies in that very elegance. History rarely arranges itself to satisfy modern narrative hunger. A theory can be beautiful and still unsupported. At present, the idea remains disputed, and the responsible position is to treat it as possible in imagination but unproven in evidence. Akhenaten's disappearance is quieter, but in some ways even more poignant. She is born into the Amarna royal family, likely the daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and she becomes the wife of Tutankhamun during the restoration. Like him, she changes her name from an Aten form to an Amun form, a living sign of the return to the old gods. In surviving images, she appears near Tutankhamun with a tenderness that carries traces of Amarna style. She's not merely decorative. Her royal blood matters. Her marriage helps bind the restored throne to the Amarna line. Yet after Tutankhamun's death, her trail becomes faint. The absence of a surviving heir makes her position dangerous. In the tomb, the two tiny mummified female fetuses likely represent the couple's daughters, buried protectively with their father. Their presence tells us that dynastic continuity was attempted but did not endure. Without an heir, the throne becomes vulnerable to older men around the court. Ay eventually becomes king, and there is evidence suggesting he may have married Akhenaten, though the matter is debated and not securely documented in the way one would wish. If such a marriage occurred, it would have helped legitimize Ay's brief rule by connecting him to the royal widow. If it did not, then her disappearance becomes even harder to explain. There is also the famous diplomatic episode preserved in Hittite records, in which an Egyptian queen, widowed and without a son, writes to the Hittite king asking for one of his sons to become her husband. The event is astonishing because an Egyptian royal woman seeking a foreign prince would have been politically shocking. Many scholars have suggested that this queen could be Akhenaten after Tutankhamun's death, though other identifications have been proposed. The Hittite prince sent in response was killed before reaching Egypt, and the episode ends in suspicion, anger, and international tension. If the widow was Akhenaten, then her situation after Tutankhamun was desperate enough to reach beyond Egypt's normal political boundaries. But the identification remains uncertain, and the documents do not give us the clean answer modern storytelling wants. The missing queens matter because they show how much Tutankhamun's tomb does not contain. It contains his afterlife equipment, his body, and traces of his family, but it does not fully explain the women whose lives shaped his legitimacy. Nefertiti's final role remains unresolved. Ankhesenamen's fate fades after a moment of potential crisis. Even Tutankhamun's mother, identified genetically but not securely named in every historical sense, stands as a reminder that DNA can reveal relationships without restoring biography. The royal women of Amarna are everywhere in the logic of the period, and yet often absent from the surviving narrative. Hidden rooms, then, are not only architectural, they are historical. There are chambers in the evidence that remain sealed because names are missing, inscriptions are damaged, tombs are lost, and later kings deliberately edited memory. Horemheb and the Ramesside rulers who follow have little interest in preserving the Amarna disruption as a legitimate sequence. Akhenaten and his successors become politically inconvenient. Their monuments are dismantled, their names omitted, their reigns compressed or ignored in official lists. The result is not total disappearance, but a broken archive. Modern scholars are left to reconstruct a family drama from altered objects, scattered inscriptions, reused blocks, damaged tombs, and bodies whose identities are still debated. This is why the search for hidden chambers carries such emotional force. It is not greed for more treasure, at least not at its best. It is the hope that somewhere, behind a wall or beneath debris, the missing grammar of the Amarna family might still exist. A burial of Nefertiti, a clearer trace of Ankhesenamun, an inscription naming a forgotten ruler. Even a small undisturbed cache could change the shape of the story. Yet archaeology must live with patience. Most walls do not hide queens. Most anomalies are natural, structural, or ambiguous. Most mysteries are solved not by a single golden door, but by slow accumulation. Tutankhamun's tomb therefore remains both revealed and unfinished. Its known rooms have changed the world's understanding of royal burial, but its surrounding questions keep widening. The young king is enclosed in gold, but around him stand women whose endings are not enclosed at all. Nefertiti, brilliant and elusive, Ankhesenamun, royal widow in a dangerous court, the unnamed or uncertain women whose bodies, titles, and relationships still resist final arrangement. The tomb's walls may or may not hide another chamber, but the story certainly does, and in that hidden space, the last royal family of Amarna continues to wait, not in perfect silence, but in fragments that still refuse to settle. The missing chambers around Tutankhamun are not only spaces in stone, they are spaces in memory. After his death, the royal family that produced him does not simply fade by accident. It is pushed into shadow by the rulers who need Egypt to remember the past differently. The Amarna age has become a political wound, and wounds in royal history are rarely left uncovered. They are cleaned, dressed, renamed, and sometimes hidden beneath monuments built by the victors. In the years after Tutankhamun, Egypt does not merely move on from Akhenaten's revolution. It begins to edit the revolution out of legitimacy. This erasure is not immediate in every place, and it is not complete. Nothing in ancient Egypt disappears perfectly. Stone blocks survive in foundations. Names remain on small objects. Tombs preserve altered traces. A damaged inscription may still reveal the shape of a forbidden cartouche. A reused object may carry the ghost of an earlier owner beneath later changes. The state can command memory, but it cannot control every chip of limestone, every buried seal, every forgotten storeroom, every object sealed in a tomb too obscure to plunder completely. Tutankhamun's fame in the modern world exists because erasure failed in just the right way. Still, the official direction after his reign is clear. I takes the throne after Tutankhamun. Ruling briefly, he is old, experienced, and politically close enough to the dead king to perform the opening of the mouth ritual on the burial chamber wall. That image gives him sacred continuity, but his reign does not solve the deeper problem of succession. After A comes Horemheb, the military commander and administrator whose reign marks a stronger effort to stabilize Egypt after the uncertainties of Amarna. Horemheb has no direct royal bloodline from the Amarna family in the way Tutankhamun does, but he has power, experience, and the ability to present himself as the man who restores order after chaos. For Horemheb, memory is a tool of government. He does not need later Egyptians to dwell on the fragile sequence from Akhenaten to Smenkhare or Neferneferuaten to Tutankhamun to A. That sequence is messy, ideologically dangerous, and full of questions. It reminds people that kingship can bend, that temples can be neglected, that gods can be displaced, that a royal city can be founded and abandoned, that the throne can pass through youth, widows, courtiers, and generals in a single troubled generation. A restored state prefers a cleaner line. So Horemheb and later tradition increasingly treat the Amarna rulers as an interruption rather than a proper dynasty. The result can be seen in later king lists, where the official chain may pass from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, as if the Amarna interval has been compressed into silence. Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and A can be omitted from formal memory, not because no one ever knew they existed, but because the version of kingship promoted by later rulers had no use for them as legitimate ancestors. This is one of the most striking reversals in Tutankhamun's story. Modern people think of him as the central face of ancient Egypt, but ancient official tradition did not preserve him that way. To later power, he was part of a problem best left unnamed. The erasure works through stone as well as lists. Akhenaten's monuments, especially the smaller standardized blocks often called talatat, are dismantled and reused in later construction. These blocks, once part of temples and buildings connected to the Aten, are packed into pylons, walls, and foundations by later rulers. This is practical, because cut stone is valuable, but it is also symbolic. The physical body of Amarna architecture is broken apart and buried inside the monuments of a restored order. A surprising detail is that this reuse later helps scholars reconstruct parts of Akhenaten's world. Blocks hidden as building fill preserve scenes that might otherwise have been destroyed completely. The attempt to bury memory becomes, by accident, a method of preservation. Tutankhamun is caught in this process awkwardly. He is not Akhenaten, the architect of the religious upheaval. He is the young king under whom the return to Amun is proclaimed. His reign issues the language of restoration. His name rejects the Aten and embraces Amun. Yet he is still too close to Amarna by blood, marriage, and chronology. He belongs to the family that later rulers prefer to distance from legitimate kingship. His restoration is useful in the moment, but his memory is not necessarily useful afterward. Once Horemheb and the early Ramesside kings can present themselves as the true continuation of order, Tutankhamun becomes expendable. This does not mean people went through Egypt trying to erase every trace of him with perfect consistency. Ancient erasure is often uneven. Some names are hammered out. Some monuments are usurped. Some objects survive because they are already buried, overlooked, or too minor to attract attention. Some traces remain because bureaucracy is never as absolute as ideology. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how deliberate each omission or alteration was in particular cases. But the broader pattern is strong enough the late Amarna succession is treated as politically uncomfortable. An official memory is reshaped to reduce its place in the royal story. The human consequence is profound. A dynasty that once presented itself in blazing sunlight beneath the Aten becomes a family of gaps. Akhenaten becomes the heretic king in later imagination, though that label simplifies ancient realities. Nefertiti becomes brilliant and missing. Smenkhkare and Neferneferuaten become puzzles of names, genders, reign lengths, and overlapping identities. Akhenaten becomes a queen whose later fate nearly vanishes. Tutankhamun becomes a restored king who is himself later pushed aside. I becomes a short-lived successor whose legitimacy is fragile. Horemheb becomes the man who turns disruption into a new official beginning. This is not only a story of personal ambition, it reflects how ancient states survive crisis. When a religious and political experiment fails, those who follow must decide what to do with the record of failure. They can condemn it openly. They can reinterpret it. They can ignore it. They can absorb its useful parts while denying its legitimacy. Egypt does all of these in different ways. It restores the old gods. It reopens traditional cults. It reasserts royal duty. It reuses stone. It rearranges names. It lets silence do some of the work. And yet silence is never empty. Beneath it, artisans remember styles. Families remember service. Priestly archives may preserve practical knowledge, even when public monuments change language. Objects already placed in tombs continue to exist with their mixed identities. The Amarna age is erased from official comfort, but not from the archaeological record. Its brokenness becomes its signature. Modern understanding of the period depends precisely on fragments, a throne scene here, a reused block there, a damaged cartouche, a diplomatic letter, a mummy with uncertain identity, a tomb whose goods may have been gathered from royal stores in haste. Tutankhamun's tomb survives as the great exception to the erasure. It is a sealed pocket of memory from a dynasty that later history tried to smooth away. The objects inside do not obey Horemheb's silence. They preserve the transition, the compromise, the anxiety, the repair. They show a king who belongs to Amun again, but who cannot be separated from Aten completely. They show a court that wants to restore the past while using materials shaped by the very period it is trying to leave behind. They show that official memory and material memory are not the same. So the dynasty is erased, but not destroyed. It survives in the stubbornness of things. It survives because stone is heavy, because tombs are hidden, because names are hard to remove completely, because power edits history, but cannot always predict which scraps will matter 3,000 years later. Tutankhamun was meant to pass into eternity as a restored king, then fade into the margins of official memory. Instead, the small tomb of a nearly forgotten pharaoh became the place where an erased age spoke louder than all the monuments built to silence it. The tomb survives as a pocket of memory, but the burial itself is designed for something deeper than memory. It is designed for transformation. To modern eyes, Tutankhamun's gold may seem like a dazzling statement of wealth, the final luxury of a royal world that believed power should glitter even in death. Yet in the Egyptian imagination, gold is not merely rich, it is durable, radiant, divine, and difficult to corrupt. It shines like the sun. It resists decay better than flesh, wood, or linen. It belongs naturally to gods whose bodies are imagined as imperishable. When gold surrounds Tutankhamun, it does not simply honor him. It helps remake him into the kind of being who can survive the dangerous passage beyond death. The mask is the most famous expression of that belief. Its calm face has become so familiar that it is easy to forget how strange it is. It is not a portrait in the modern sense, not a spontaneous likeness of a young man near the end of his life. It is an ideal royal face, composed, symmetrical, ageless, and remote. The eyes look forward with the stillness that seems almost beyond human attention. The striped Nimes headcloth, false beard, broad collar, and inlaid features place Tutankhamun within the language of kingship and divinity. The mask does not show how he suffered, walked, spoke, or aged. It shows what Egypt needed him to become. That difference matters. The mummy beneath the mask is fragile, darkened, damaged, and medically debated. The mask above it is serene and complete. The two do not cancel each other. They belong to the same funerary logic. Death has broken the body. So ritual gives the dead a perfected image. The person is not denied. The person is repaired through sacred form. The gold face is a promise placed over vulnerable flesh. It says that the king's identity can outlast the injuries of time, illness, embalming and burial. It says that human weakness can be enclosed within divine permanence. Around the mummy, layers multiply. Tutankhamun is placed inside nested coffins, one within another, and then within a stone sarcophagus, itself enclosed by great gilded shrines that fill much of the burial chamber. This architecture of protection is almost obsessive, but it is not random. Egyptian funerary thought often works through layering wrappings, amulets, coffins, spells, images, doors, chambers, seals, and divine guardians. Every layer creates a boundary against disorder. Every boundary helps preserve the form through which rebirth becomes possible. The dead king is not simply hidden. He is wrapped in a theological structure. The shrines surrounding the sarcophagus are especially powerful because they turn the burial chamber into a sacred interior. Their gilded surfaces, inscriptions, and protective figures make the space feel less like a room and more like a portable temple built around the dead. In life, gods dwell in shrines within temple sanctuaries, approached through ritual and guarded by layers of access. In death, the king receives a similar treatment. The body becomes the sacred center. The chamber becomes a sanctuary. The outer world is held at a distance by wood, gold, spells, and silence. Amulets placed among the wrappings make this protection more intimate. They are not decorative jewelry alone, though many are beautiful. They have specific purposes. A scarab may protect the heart or symbolize rebirth. A jed pillar may invoke stability. A Tayat knot may connect with divine protection. Eye amulets, serpent forms, divine figures, collars, bracelets, and small protective objects turn the mummy into a carefully guarded landscape. Each piece belongs to a system in which materials, colours, shapes, words, and placement matter. The evidence remains incomplete for how every object was understood in every moment, but what survives in the record suggests a detailed magical anatomy, a sacred technology applied directly to the king's body. The heart is especially important in Egyptian belief because it is tied to identity, memory, conscience, and judgment. In many funerary traditions, the heart must be preserved and protected so the deceased can pass through the weighing before Osiris. Tutankhamun's apparent missing heart has therefore attracted attention. Scholars still debate why it is absent or whether the evidence should be interpreted differently, and no single explanation fully accounts for the anomaly. But the uncertainty itself reveals how deeply the Egyptians cared about bodily completeness and symbolic substitution. If something is missing, Ritual may compensate. If a body is vulnerable, magic surrounds it. If death opens a gap, objects and spells attempt to close it. Osiris stands behind much of this golden afterlife. The dead king is associated with Osiris, lord of the underworld, whose own story centers on death, restoration, and renewed life. Black resin on the mummy, sometimes understood in connection with fertility, soil, and Osirian regeneration, gives the body a dark, sacred surface beneath the gold. This contrast is striking blackness of rebirth under radiance of solar divinity. Tutankhamun's afterlife is not built from one idea alone. It joins solar renewal, Osirian resurrection, royal power, temple ritual, and protective magic into a single system. Egyptian religion is often complex in this way, layering meanings rather than choosing only one. The Book of the Dead and related funerary traditions provide spells and images to help the deceased navigate dangers, speak correctly, transform, breathe, eat, move, and join the divine order. In royal tombs, texts and scenes can map the sun god's nocturnal journey through the underworld, where darkness is not merely emptiness but a region of gates, beings, tests, renewal, and cosmic rhythm. Tutankhamun's tomb does not contain the vast painted programs of larger royal tombs, but its burial equipment and chamber scenes still place him inside that sacred journey. The modest architecture is compensated for by concentrated ritual force. The tomb may be small, but the afterlife it imagines is immense. The opening of the mouth ritual shown on the burial chamber wall is central to this transformation. Through ritual action, the dead king's senses and capacities are restored. He can breathe, speak, see, hear, eat, and receive offerings. This is not metaphor in a weak sense. For Egyptians, ritual makes things happen in the sacred order. A statue can receive life. A mummy can be reanimated for the afterlife. A name can preserve existence. A painted scene can continue performing its function. The image of A carrying out the ritual is therefore both funerary and political, but it is also deeply practical within Egyptian belief. Tutankhamun must be made able again. The canopic equipment continues the same purpose. The organs removed during mummification are protected separately, associated with divine guardians and placed within containers of extraordinary craftsmanship. These not waste remains. They are parts of the royal person preserved within a sacred arrangement. The body is divided and restored, opened and sealed, human and divine. Death disassembles, ritual reassembles. The tomb exists to make that reassembly permanent. What makes Tutankhamun's golden afterlife so moving is the tension between abundance and fear. The wealth is magnificent, but the need behind it is anxious. So many layers, so many amulets, so many words, so many guards, so much gold, all of it suggests that eternity is not assumed automatically. It must be built, defended, maintained, and renewed. Even a king is not safe simply because he is a king. He needs help. He needs gods. He needs craftsmen. He needs priests. He needs names, images, seals, offerings, and objects. The golden afterlife is not arrogance alone. It is also a profound expression of human unease before disappearance. Tutankhamun's burial therefore becomes a luminous answer to fragility. The young king's life is brief, his reign politically delicate, his body uncertain, his dynasty nearly erased. But the tomb refuses to let him dissolve. It surrounds him with the strongest materials, the most sacred symbols, and the most careful protections his world can gather. The mask looks calm because it is meant to calm death itself. The coffins shine because darkness must be answered. The amulets cling to the body because every part of the king must be defended. Beneath all the splendour is one simple hope, repeated in gold, that what is loved, feared, named, and ritually protected may somehow endure. The golden afterlife succeeded in a way no priest, scribe, or craftsman could have imagined. Tutankhamun was meant to endure in the hidden West, protected by seals, shrines, names, spells, and the silence of the Valley of the Kings. Instead, his eternity broke open into cameras, newspapers, museum halls, scientific scans, conservation debates, school books, documentaries, replicas, souvenirs, and the endless modern hunger for a face from the ancient world. The tomb did not simply preserve a king, it created a modern phenomenon. A ruler nearly erased from official memory became, by accident and survival, the most famous pharaoh on earth. That fame is misleading and revealing at the same time. Tutankhamun is not the pharaoh who built the Great Pyramid. He is not the conquering warrior Thutmose III, not the powerful Amenhotep III, not the long-reigning Rameses II. His own reign is short, his monuments limited, his political choices shaped by older advisors in the aftermath of Amarna. If the tomb had been robbed like so many others, he might remain a minor name known mainly to specialists. One more brief ruler in a complicated royal sequence. But archaeology does not always reward historical importance in a balanced way. It rewards survival, because his tomb survived. Tutankhamun became the vessel through which the world imagines ancient Egypt. What he revealed was astonishing. His burial gave scholars an almost complete royal funerary assemblage from the New Kingdom, a crowded but coherent world of objects still connected by context. It showed how the Egyptians equipped a king for eternity, not with a few symbolic treasures, but with a complete environment of protection, comfort, status, ritual, and transformation. It preserved textiles, furniture, food, chariots, weapons, games, cosmetics, oils, shrines, coffins, jewelry, amulets, and personal items in relationships that would have been lost if they'd been scattered by ancient thieves or early collectors. Each object alone matters. Together they form a rare grammar of royal death. It also revealed the power of small details. A worn staff can speak as strongly as a golden coffin. A game board can complicate the image of a solemn divine king. Altered inscriptions can show a court adapting objects under pressure. A throne scene can preserve the tenderness and religious ambiguity of the Amarna age. The two tiny burials placed with the king point to a broken line of succession, handled not as spectacle, but as part of a protected royal funerary setting. The tomb's small rooms, limited decoration, and signs of reuse suggest urgency. The evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern tells us that this was not simply a royal burial. It was a response to a sudden death at the end of a wounded dynasty. At the same time, Tutankhamun obscured as much as he revealed. His gold became so overwhelming that it flattened Egypt in the public imagination. For many viewers, ancient Egypt became treasure, curses, mummies, and mysterious kings, while the deeper civilization behind those images faded into background. The farmers who fed the temples, the quarry workers who moved stone, the scribes who managed accounts, the women who sustained households, the craftsmen whose names were rarely recorded, the priests who rehearsed ritual language, and the local communities that gave Egypt its continuity were all harder to see beneath the glare of the mask. Tutankhamun's tomb is extraordinary, but it is not all of Egypt. It is one royal pocket from one moment of crisis. Modern science has also changed what he keeps. The tomb is no longer only an object of wonder, it is a field of ongoing analysis. CT scans, DNA studies, material science, residue analysis, textile conservation, and careful re-examination of inscriptions all continue to reshape interpretations. Some older theories have weakened. The murder story, once popular, looks less convincing under later imaging. Medical explanations have become more layered, combining possible infection, malaria, inherited vulnerability, injury, and uncertainty. Ideas about hidden chambers have risen, fallen, and remain debated as surveys are interpreted and reinterpreted. No single explanation fully accounts for every strange detail, and responsible scholarship has learned to move more slowly than public excitement. Conservation has become part of the story too. The tomb was not built for millions of modern eyes, electric lights, changing humidity, human breath, and constant attention. The act of revealing it began a new kind of danger: painted walls, fragile surfaces, wood, linen, resins, and even the surrounding environment must be protected not only from robbers, but from admiration. This is one of Tutankhamun's modern paradoxes. The world loves him so much that it can harm what it loves. Replicas, controlled access, museum conservation, climate monitoring, and careful study all belong to his second afterlife, the one created not by priests but by conservators. He also changed Egypt's relationship with its own ancient heritage in the modern world. The discovery took place in a period of political transition, when questions of control, ownership, excavation rights, foreign influence, and national identity were deeply alive. Tutankhamun's treasures became not merely archaeological finds, but symbols of Egyptian patrimony. They helped shape global fascination, but they also intensified the question of who has the right to study, display, move, interpret, and profit from the ancient dead. The story is therefore not only about 1320s BCE Egypt or 1922 archaeology, it is also about the modern world learning, unevenly and imperfectly, that ancient heritage belongs first to the land and people from which it comes. The mystery survives because Tutankhamun stands at several thresholds at once. He stands between Aten and Amun, between Amarna and restoration, between childhood and adulthood, between royal image and damaged body, between obscurity and fame, between ancient ritual privacy and modern public display. He is known through the most famous face in archaeology, yet the person behind that face remains elusive. We know his approximate age, his royal context, his burial equipment, his restored name, his young death, and some evidence of health problems. But we do not fully know his thoughts, his voice, his private fears, his relationship with Akhenaten, the exact circumstances of his death, or how much power he truly held over the decisions made in his name. That is what Tut still keeps, not merely treasure hidden in rooms, but distance. The tomb brought him closer than almost any pharaoh, yet it did not make him fully available. It allowed the modern world to see his sandals, his linen, his games, his mask, his coffins, his body, and the walls around his burial. But seeing is not the same as possessing the whole truth. The young king remains partly sealed, not by stone now, but by the limits of evidence, the damage of time, and the difference between what ancient people meant and what modern people want. In the end, Tutankhamun's greatest secret may be that survival is never neutral. What survives shapes what is remembered. A small tomb saved by accident becomes a civilization's emblem. A brief reign becomes a global legend. A damaged mummy becomes a medical mystery. A funerary mask becomes almost a second son, and beneath all of it, the real young king remains quiet, surrounded by the world that tried to make him eternal, and the modern world that still cannot stop asking who he was. The Valley of the Kings grows softer in the imagination as the story closes. The heat fades, the cliffs turn from gold to violet, then to a deeper blue, and the paths between the tombs seem to empty again. The voices of excavators, priests, workmen, tourists, guards, scholars, and kings recede into the dry air. What remains is stone, dust, and the old Western silence that held Tutankhamun for more than 3,000 years. His story does not end with an answer. It ends with layers. A young king born into the aftermath of religious upheaval, a court trying to restore balance, a queen whose later fate slips into shadow, a body wrapped in ritual care and later examined by modern science, a tomb too small for the fame it would one day carry, a mask bright enough to hide fragility and reveal it at the same time. There is comfort, perhaps, in the fact that even the most famous dead are not completely taken from mystery. Tutankhamun has been photographed, scanned, measured, displayed, interpreted, doubted, and admired, yet something of him remains beyond reach. The past does not give itself all at once. It survives in fragments, and every fragment asks for patience. A name on a seal, a staff worn smooth, a wall scene painted in haste, a gold face laid over a damaged body. These are not the whole person. But they are not nothing. They are the pieces time allowed to remain. And so Tutankhamun's tomb becomes more than an archaeological discovery. It becomes a meditation on memory itself. Civilizations build monuments against disappearance. But disappearance comes anyway, slowly, unevenly, and without malice. Then, sometimes, by accident, a sealed room survives, a forgotten stair appears beneath rubble, a candle enters darkness, wonderful things emerge, and with them, wonderful uncertainties. Far above the burial chamber, night settles over the valley. The stars return to the desert sky, the same stars the Egyptians folded into ceilings, coffins, prayers, and royal dreams of rebirth. The young king is no longer hidden as he once was, but neither is he fully gone into explanation. He remains where history often leaves its most haunting figures half revealed, half protected, shining faintly through the dust, still keeping a little silence for himself,